What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Capitalized Podcast. I'm Chris Casella, and as always, this episode is brought to you by our private lending company, Sharper Capital Partners. If you want to learn more about how Sharper Capital can help you build your real estate investing business, you can check us out at sharpercapital.com. Today, I'm here with Dylan Koch, who is an off-market real estate investor based out of Cincinnati, Ohio. He's been in real estate full-time for about 3 years, and he's done over 125 total deals, totaling about $1.5 million, not just 100, but $1.5 million. And he's purchased over $4 million of real estate for his own portfolio, which currently totals about 41 units. Dylan, thanks a lot for being here today.
Yeah, Chris, thanks for having me.
Of course. So please tell me, what does it mean to be an off-market real estate investor?
Pretty much off-market real estate basically just means that we go direct to seller and we try to do all of our deals and acquisitions not on the MLS. And whether that be from marketing campaigns or referrals or whatever it is we kind of take the acquisition side into our own hands.
And what are some of the benefits and drawbacks of sourcing your own deals off market? And why was that the route that you decided to take with your investing career?
Yeah, so like most things, it was like it was a necessity and the reason I say that is because, I started investing in 2018. It's just like very newbie, and deals on MLS, you could still make pencil. But then as real estate got hotter, interest rates got lower, it got more competitive, and I couldn't make anything on the MLS make sense for our underwriting standards. And so we decided to explore how to get, better deals, and eventually just our own learning and education brought us to off-market real estate. I joined a couple of groups, paid for a couple of programs, and so we started doing direct to seller. And basically what that means, it's a lot of direct mail, especially at the beginning. And we still do that to this day. But then there are other avenues that we can get into. There's texting that was popular for a while that's had some pullback due to regulation. There's cold calling, pay-per-click, pay-per-lead, inbound, outbound marketing. And it's basically just going direct to seller. That's the pros. The pros is that you can basically source some really good deals. And the con is it takes money. We put several $1,000s into marketing every month. And if you don't convert some of those leads to deals, then you're basically just setting some money on fire.
Tell me about the texting campaign. Tell me about the natural progression the progression that's taken place with texting, because I know that used to be a super hot way for people to source off-market deals. There's been, like you mentioned, some regulation that's been put in place. And lately, from my perspective, I've been hearing people say that texting is a lot less effective. So can you kind of talk about what's been going on as somebody who sources deals directly off-market? What does texting look like, and how has that evolved recently?
Yeah, so basically SMS blasting is how it's known in the industry. It was very popular, and you would just download a list of, let's call it high equity people, non-owner occupied. You'd skip trace them, get the most probable numbers. And then there's several services out there. We used Launch Control for a long time. I think Batch does it now too, and you hired a VA, and basically it was a volume thing. How many people could you contact? And you basically say, hey, we're interested in 123 Main Street. Would you be considering an offer? And a very low percentage of those leads would turn to deals, but texting was such a cheap thing compared to other marketing channels that it didn't really matter. But through the years, basically the carriers, Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, all those started to impose regulations. It's called 10 DLC. I really don't know what that means or stands for, but it got a lot harder to text, and it basically was considered spamming people's phones, which I can even understand. I don't like the random cold calls or texts that I get either. And so basically carriers started flagging numbers. They would look for things like offer or purchase or property. They would flag certain keywords. And so it got very, very hard. And it basically shut down almost overnight as soon as these regulations came into place. You can still do it to an extent, but it has to be opt-in. People have to say hey, you can text this number. So, just think about the number of people that you could just mass market to now it's, just a very low number of people. So we still do it just because we've had some data for a couple of years now, but it is far less effective today. To give you some numbers by that, I think our cost per deal for texting in 2022 or 2023 is probably around $2,500. Today it's probably closer to 5,000.
5,000 for texting today?
Yeah, as a cost per deal basis, yes.
That's really interesting. And I agree. I mean, I don't like getting those texts either. But as a way of mass marketing just being so cheap, I think the barrier to entry to sourcing direct off-market deals is super low, right? You can just go really anybody can just go and they can start door knocking at the very lowest level.
Yep.
And then maybe you start to evolve and you start pulling data from online, and then you'd probably go when texting was effective to texting because it was such a cheap way to do it if you wanted to start scaling your business. But that kind of brings up a point that I'm curious about, Dylan, for you. What has your natural progression been for sourcing off market deals in terms of your marketing strategies? Because there's a lot of different ways to do it. Some of them you just touched on. What did it look like for you when you were first starting, and what does it look like today?
The whole time, direct mail has been our number one source of deal flow, and that hasn't changed. I don't think that will change. And then followed by texting, and then probably cold calling. We've done some of the pay-per-click and pay-per-lead things. And for people, pay-per-click is like Google ads or Facebook ads. Pay-per-lead is like these third-party companies that get really good at like SEO. So when people type in, need to sell my house fast, Cincinnati or whatever it is, they're the first people that pop up, and then they just give that lead to the highest bidder in that market. And we haven't had a lot of success with some of those, honestly. And because the leads this turned up not to be great leads. So progression, I for now that texting is a little, that was a third of our deal flow in 2023. I think we'll honestly just resort back to more direct mail. And I've been very concentrated basically on the 3 or 4 surrounding counties. I think to do more volume, I would need to spend more money, more marketing dollars, but maybe even expand to Northern Kentucky or maybe whatever that, or broaden the like the categories that we market to. Does that make sense? So instead of just tired landlords with 30% projected equity, maybe we go to 20% projected equity, right? So you're expanding how many people you can touch.
Sure. So maybe your conversion rate is a little bit lower, but you're just casting a broader net. So your total and aggregate number of deals increases.
Exactly.
So you mentioned that 1/3 of your deal flow in 2023 was texting. You also mentioned that the cost per lead today for text, or the cost per deal for texting today, is about $5,000. Can you talk about what your marketing budget looks like, what your conversion rate looks like today? I know that you're a big data guy, and I think it's really important in this business to be big on data. So can you kind of run through some of those data points?
Yeah,
for
I have
us?
some of it pulled up here. So basically what our conversion rate looks like is we spend probably anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 a month on direct mail. And then the cold calling and the texting, I actually just hired a third party to do it for me. And that's $2,500 a month. But that includes the texting, the cold calling. I still provide the skip tracing and the list. But they basically have a VA that goes through and does the cold calling and texting for me. And then just send through a Zap, sends it to my CRM. Right now, our cost per lead is about $50 a lead. We try to get about 20 to 25 leads in to convert a deal. And then, so our cost per deal right now, if with referrals, because referrals don't, account for any money, is about $3,000. Without referrals, is about $5,000. Right. And so we try to convert every 1 to 2 of those 50 leads that come in. And depending on the exit strategy, whether it be a wholesale, a fix and flip, that's when your revenue projections change. So, and we get into this, but we've been flipping a little bit more as of late, just because wholesaling has gotten, I think it's just with rates and the natural order of the market, it's just got a little bit harder to wholesale good deals lately.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. First of all, thank you for sharing some of that data. I think that stuff is really insightful. And I think it varies so much between different direct to seller operations, even around town in Columbus. And we talk to a lot of these guys, and it varies so much because everybody has a different strategy, which I think is a good thing, because that means that there's a lot of room, there's a lot of opportunity in the market for a lot of different players. I do think that there's overlap with a lot of deals in certain markets, and you sort of get to know each other very well if you're operating at a high level in a certain space. But going back to your point about you taking down some of the deals yourself, which is what I assume you mean, you're flipping some of the deals that you get direct to seller rather than wholesaling them, right?
Correct. Yep.
One of the reasons, I was looking at some data from RCN this morning before we hopped on this call, and they put out a survey. I don't know how many people are included in the survey, but I do know it's nationwide. And one of the biggest setbacks that people are facing right now is something like 60% of people answered that the biggest setback in real estate investing right now is just higher rates. Some of them were saying lower inventory. Some of them were saying higher housing prices, but a vast majority were saying it's higher rates. So I do think, and maybe I'd be curious to hear what your perspective on this is, why wholesaling might be slowing down and why you might be having to take down some of those deals, and really kind of how it impacts your business too, Dylan, if you don't mind touching on that.
Yeah. So I if you go back to the beginning, I started this to buy more rentals, right? Like I really just wanted more rentals. And then you find out that you can monetize some of these leads that come in for, areas that you don't want, or you don't want to buy in. Someone does, like I don't want to own, the D class part of the town, but it doesn't mean everybody's that way. And with rates, you try to get something that costs $300,000 to pencil, a single family home or something that actually cash flows, PITI plus utilities plus some reserves. Like it's hard right now with the 7.5%, 8% rates. And so I think that's basically, I think your buyer pool just went down because people who buy and hold aren't buying as much. But if you're still in that median price point, I think in here in Cincinnati is range from 225 to 275. There's still people who need homes, right? So the flipping market, at least to us, has gone up, and our revenue's gone up. But out of the 41 units we own, we bought the majority of those 2022 and 2023. Like, I didn't really buy a whole lot recently because of the rates, and I couldn't get anything to pencil, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it certainly does. And it reminds me that scrolling down in that survey, the number of people whose main strategy who took that survey was buy and hold was similar proportions. It was something closer to like 60%. So a lot of these people who are answering, I think a vast majority of real estate investors in general are buy and hold investors, because that you can be a W-2 employee and just be slowly building up your rental portfolio over time, or you can be a full-time real estate investor and have a larger portfolio. But the number of people who fix and flip and also have a W-2, I think, are slimmer. So my main point in saying that, I think a vast majority, to your point, Dylan, of real estate investors are buy and hold investors. And right now it's just really hard to make those numbers pencil. So we're seeing the same thing. And I'm curious to see where it goes in this market. But going back, if we kind of take a step back and we go all the way back to the beginning of your story, you grew up in a small town in Ohio. And one thing that you said to me before is that you had a rich dad, poor dad upbringing. And I think a lot of us as real estate investors are familiar with the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. But what did you mean by that when you said you had a rich dad, poor dad upbringing?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's very, I guess, stereotypical out of the book where, my my parents are very blue collar. They worked in factories. They wanted a better life for their kid. And so their means to do that was like, get a good education, get a good education, go to college, get a good paying job. And it was with love. I mean, they did it like, that's what they thought that was best. And I can't blame them for that. But so that's what I did. I mean, the first, I got good grades in high school. I went to UC down here, got a pharmacy degree. So 2 years of undergrad, 4 years of graduate school. I graduated in 2017. I was 24 years old and making like 120 grand a year. So I thought I was on top of the world, right? And I tell people this too, that if pharmacy was like what it was when I got started in 2012, I might still be a pharmacist, but it changed a lot. Like, it was always, I was retail facing. I worked for, Kroger down here in Cincinnati. It was always do more with less. The job kept getting worse and worse and worse. And the impetus of investing was, I'm going to make decent money. I should know what to do with it. So I went down the Dave Ramsey rabbit hole for a while, but I just had the personality. When I touch something, I tend to go very deep into it. I don't know if that's like an addictive personality or not, but so I just kept learning and reading and investing in like podcasts, everything under the sun about investing in personal finance. And eventually that led me to real estate. And I was like, this seems like the best path forward for me personally. And so I bought that house back in 2018. Pharmacy was getting worse. I was in a manager position. I enjoy this investing side more. I was young. I didn't have any kids. I wasn't married yet. So I basically just said, fuck it. And I was like, 10 years from now, am I going to regret this decision? And if I fall flat on my face, at least I know I tried, right? I didn't really have much to lose then. So I just went for it. And I left in October of 2021, my full-time job. And I've been doing this ever since. And I definitely don't regret it.
It's interesting to hear, because $120,000 in 2017, even now, I mean, what is that, 7 years later, about in 2024? I mean, that's a lot more money in 2017 than it is now too.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to hear that, you grew up in a blue collar family. You ended up doing exactly kind of what the highest and best route really is from a situation like that, right? At least more generally speaking, or conservatively speaking. You started making 120 grand and then you still wanted more. And what was it that kept you from looking for another W-2? I mean, why did you want to go and say, hey, I'm going to take this giant leap and go into real estate rather than go and maybe look for something that pays more? I mean, was there something about the freedom? Just, I guess I'll try not to lead that question, but
no. I get what you're going. So there's a couple of things. One, pharmacy in general is you start high, but you stay. It's really a plateau. Like, even my colleagues who've been in the business for 30 years weren't really making that much more than I started out with, right? So there's really no, however hard you work, there's no incentive to work harder, even though I was raised that way. And then two, I wanted the freedom, obviously, like the financial freedom aspect, which everyone I feel starts with the same goals. Like, I want rentals, $200 a month in cash flow. I want $5,000 cover my expenses. Like, everyone has a similar story. But once you start to do that, you realize, one, you actually need some money. Bigger pockets pushes, like, you can do this with very little money. I think you actually need some money to do this. And my W-2 helped me to put in a great position for that, right? Like, I paid down my student loans very quickly. I was working a shit ton of overtime. So my DTI credit all looked great to lenders when I was starting, which definitely helped. But then you start to, okay, well, it's going to take me this many rentals to get to my number, and all that. You do this like math and you're like, you need a scalable income. And I think you need to grow skill sets to give you a scalable income. And really, I don't know a better way to do that other than like sales, and that's kind of what off-market real estate is. It's a sales and marketing business. And now the sky's kind of the limit. You can create your own business. And I don't want to do this forever. I've told people that like this is a means to an end. But once we get there, I mean, we're expecting our first kid here in September. I'll be able to go to the baseball events, dance recitals, softball, whatever it is, right? Like, and that's the ultimate reason and ultimate why.
Absolutely. I think the point that you touched on, and that last point definitely resonates. But I think another one that stands out to me, which is common for a lot of self-starters, a lot of entrepreneurs, is we just want to be compensated for the amount of effort and time that we're putting into something. And I think your point about being a pharmacist, I felt that way when I was working my first W-2 job out of college as well, is even though there was some large upside to the different positions that you could hold in the job that I was working, I was in finance, it wasn't a better lifestyle. You were making a lot more money, but the lifestyle almost got worse as you progressed, and it was pretty tough to begin with. So I can definitely resonate with that. For the people who are listening who do have a W-2, or maybe they're in college and they're thinking about what they're going to do when they leave, what kind of tangible steps did you take to leave your W-2 and to go full-time into real estate? What did your transition actually look like?
Yeah. And this is a kind of a hot topic because people always be like, I'll keep my W-2 as a safety net. I'll get to my freedom number with the rentals and then I'll quit and I'll do something else. There's nothing wrong with that strategy. I just think it's going to take longer than people think. Whereas if you put yourself in a position, let's say you quit that W-2 and now you have 40 hours to dedicate to, making income, I think you can surprise yourself with how quickly you can replace that W-2 income, right? I think people will be surprised on not how easy, but how quickly you can do that. The other side of this is I fully recognize I was more in a privileged position at this point because I was engaged to my now wife, who is a pharmacist. She makes good money. I'm on her insurance. So that aspect I really didn't have to worry about. And I recognize I had an advantage there. But even if I didn't have that, I think I still would have done it. Especially if you're under the age of 26, like you can still be on your parents' insurance, right? And I don't know. I think it was more of the, am I going to regret not doing this 10 years from now that pushed me over the edge than getting into those steps. But if anything, it's just building up the skill set. But you need to take, I always tell, like people ask me all the time, it's like imperfect action is better than perfection. And that's hard transition coming from a corporate America, especially pharmacy world. Like you literally have to be perfect or like people get hurt. And so it's always like you do your spreadsheets and I look back at a couple of deals. I'm like, I could have bought this, but the cash on cash was 15% instead of like 20 what I wanted. I'm like, that was dumb. Like I should have just bought these instead. Like, so but hindsight's 2020 and that just takes experience.
Sure. And so, I mean, from your perspective, when you think about taking imperfect action rather than trying to be perfect all the time and maybe not making any progress, can you kind of walk through what steps you took as a pharmacist? And listen, like, to your point about insurance and to your point about circumstances, I think that's all important. And maybe we do caveat with that. But I think at the same time, there's a reason not to do anything. And, when I left my job, I left a good paying job. I was still on my parents' insurance, but then I turned 26 and I wasn't on my parents' insurance anymore. And I still didn't have another job.
Yeah.
And I just went to the marketplace and I got insurance and it was more expensive and it wasn't as good as the insurance that I had before, but you just make it work. So I think there's some caveats, I think, and I can respect that. But I also think there's something to be said about just making it happen. And I love your points about imperfect action. So can you talk to us about what kind of imperfect action you took?
Chris, there's a lot of education. And so like I read all the books and I was one of those guys who I'd read a book, I wouldn't do anything, I'd pick up another book. And eventually it's just like, you can't learn anymore without actually doing. So the first thing we did, like I bought that house hack, it was 3.5% down, right? And that kind of got my feet wet into what being a real estate owner is. But then at the beginning, the first couple of deals were all duplexes that we found on the market that were 25% down. And then we learned the BRRRR strategy, which is like, does that velocity of money. And I don't know, I guess at the beginning, I wasn't buying deals that would bankrupt us, even if it didn't cash flow, because like my job could cover it. And the other thing is just make relationships with people who have done it before you. And a lot of the times, if you bring them a deal or you say, hey, I'm just getting started, I'm thinking about buying this, can I just have like your opinion on it? And I remember the first couple of deals I sent to, my now CPA, attorneys, friends that were doing it or colleagues that I met and like, yeah, dude, I would do this all day long. And like, I don't know, I just kind of trusted their advice at the same time of being confident in the underwriting too. Like like you said at the beginning, I'm kind of a numbers guy. And I'm like, so if it penciled and it worked, I was like, okay, let's do it. There wasn't really any second thoughts after that.
Yeah, and I think that's a common theme. I was just sitting down with another, Grant and I both were sitting down with another real estate investor, now client of ours, who does a lot of business here in Cincinnati. And one of the things that he said right off the bat when we asked him about why he's been so successful is he's like, I just don't overthink. And I think it's easy to say that when you have a lot of experience. It's maybe a little bit harder when you're first starting out. But I think those two things that you just mentioned with the imperfect action and also the ability to go forward and have some confidence, I think those both of those things, they kind of work in a loop, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they reinforce one another. And so I think that's a great point.
Tim Ferriss, he is kind of, I guess, an older podcaster now, but he has a good exercise called the fear setting one. And it's basically like, what's your worst case scenario? Write down what your worst case scenario is if you go through something. And a lot of times it's not as bad as you think, right? Like, okay, yeah, what if the toilet floods in the middle of the night? You call Roto-Rooter and they come take care of it. Or you call a plumber and it costs you a couple $1,000. Like, it's just part of the education. I don't know.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because that is the literal exercise that led me to leaving my W-2. So
There you go. I
I'm
love
really
that.
glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Also funny that Tim Ferriss is now an old podcaster because I feel like it was just a couple years ago that he was the most popular one.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
moving on here, Dylan. So I think at this point in your career, well, the one that we were just talking about, where you were buying a few rentals and you maybe were just now leaving your W-2 or you were kind of building up to that phase, I think you and I both would say you'd consider yourself a real estate investor at that point. But I think you and I both would agree that there's a difference between investors and business owners. So in your opinion, what's the difference and which one are you at this point?
Good question. I would actually consider myself both, but more of a, I would say, business owner slash operator. Owners don't work the day to day in their business. I still am very much involved in the business, and so I mean, this is responsible. Like business owners in running a business is like you have overhead. You have people that you're responsible for, whether they be 1099 or salaried. You know, and you have KPIs that you follow and manage. And so the difference being like investor kind of just looks like where to allocate capital the best. You know, they're looking at ROI, cash on cash returns, where the best use of that money is, whether that be real estate or stocks, bonds, crypto, whatever you want. Whereas being a business owner, you actually have a lot more weight in your shoulders, in my opinion. And your idea is like to grow the company to the size that you want, but then ultimately to put pieces in place where you're not, you know, the key person anymore. Right. So business owners can make a lot of money with the scaling aspect of that. And to me, it's using that as a way to make a large vertical income, a large active income, and then pouring that back into the real estate side of things for the investing side. That's my motto going forward for the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I love that. And I couldn't agree more. Let's drill down a little bit if you're okay with this and talk about what your business looks like right now. You mentioned employees, you mentioned some contractors. What does your business look like right now from an organizational standpoint? And well, let's start there. Let's start with your
Yeah.
organization.
So I would, and you know, we've had some success, but I would consider myself even, you know, a hustlepreneur, or as like Kiyosaki is that cash flow quadrant. I am like the S, like this is self-employed. I basically created on the job for myself. But I think everyone almost has to start there before they start scaling. Right now, it's really me, a full-time bookkeeper, and 2 full-time VAs. And then obviously all the contractors that we use are 1099. But so I'm still very much involved in the day-to-day. The next acquisition I wanted to, or the next hire, I want to be an acquisitions person to help doing some of the lead follow-up, because I'm definitely spreading myself too thin on some of the stuff. And I guess if you want to throw in, I just offloaded some of my rentals to a property manager. So that's freeing up some time as well.
That's huge. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's where the business is at now. And I really don't think I will be able to do more throughput without hiring somebody, right? Like we're very much on pace to do the same amount of deals as we are last year. And that's simply because the business looks the same, right? So that's where it's at now, where it's at going forward. I'm okay with having a small team. I think you can have a 7-figure business with like 5 or 6 people. So it would be me, an acquisition person, a dispo person, a transaction coordinator, bookkeeper, and an admin. Like if I get those pieces in place, I think sky's the limit.
How did you know in your business when the right time was to hire your first employee? You know, and I consider a VA an employee too. I mean, I think very much so.
Yeah.
It's so when did you know and how did you know in your business that it was time to hire?
I didn't have enough hours in the day, and I still don't. Like, you know, and like all the leads that come in, treating your leads is probably one of the most important things. Speed to lead is very important in this business, but so is lead follow up. And it was getting to the point where I wouldn't follow up with the leads as much as they should be. And I would lose out on qualified leads. This is someone who got them at the right time, followed up accordingly. Like, my new leads or someone else's old leads and vice versa. And so I basically was like, it's either hire these people or do less deals. It was the ultimatum I had. And I am in another, real estate community that pretty much is like, they've done this already. They've gone through the motions. And so like, dude, you need to hire somebody. And again, I just kind of took their advice and like their best practices. And that's what we did. And I still need to hire somebody. But if you want to get into like the real estate side of things, the liquidity cycle in real estate is hard sometimes, managing cash. And right now I have a lot of money tied up in projects. And so I want to sell some of these deals. And then my plan is the next hire is to put another job posting out there.
Okay. And when you're thinking about the timing of hiring, how has your mindset changed as a business owner after hiring employees and seeing the difference that they can make in your business? How has your mindset changed now compared to when you were doing it all yourself?
Yeah. So at the beginning, it's more of a scarcity mindset, and it's like, keep your overhead low, get some money in first. And I still agree with that. Like, you should prove to yourself that you can make some revenue. And I feel like scaling was the hot topic thing there for a while. So people tried to scale really quickly without having a lot of momentum in place for that. And I know people personally who got caught up and then had to let people go. But there's two sides of that token. Then there's being too conservative for too long, which I would probably fall in that camp. And I think Hormozy does a good job about articulating these, but like, being a business owner, you're looking for the max output with as little input as possible. And the best leverage that you can get really is with like rock star people. Like, and those can be offshore talent. Like, there is some VAs that can kill it. Right. So
100%.
I think it's just, my business now is like, okay, if I hire this person, they cost me $2,000, $2,500 a month, but they can bring in $30,000 to $40,000 a month. It's almost like a no brainer. But then you just have the pieces in place. Like, don't set them up for failure, right? Have the SOPs, have the KPIs in place. So that way, what gets measured, or what is it? What's the saying that Tim Draper has? Like, what gets measured gets managed. And so you need to have those pieces in place. Don't just bring someone in, like, hit the dialer and then expect them to do good work. Right.
Right. I think a major point of consideration when you're hiring is that in a perfect world, you hire just before you need to hire, because that way you kind of hit the ground running. You're at a point where you still have enough time to train, to create the SOPs, to really have a role for somebody to come into. At the same time, what's hard about that is if you're hiring before you need to hire, as an entrepreneur, one of the scariest things is, somebody who makes you pay them $2,500 a month, they maybe could make you 30. But what if they don't make you anything, and then you're paying them $2,500 a month and you never do a deal again? And I think, to your point, Dylan, I think that's a scarcity mindset, but it is really hard, even if you do have proof of concept, to take that leap. But it's why so many people don't.
I think is my answer to that anyway. We like to have 6 months of operating expenses at any given time in the bank account. And so you hire $2,500. Again, what's your worst case scenario? $2,500 a month times 6, whatever that is. That is your worst case. You're out that money, but you probably learned something along the way, right? So maybe it's just a cost of education. People go to college and spend $100,000 on liberal arts degrees. So like, what does it matter?
True. It's very true. So what is your system? And this is the last point I'll talk about on the team piece, but I think it is important. What does your process look like for bringing on a new team member? Because you're spread thin right now and you need to hire somebody,
Mm-hmm.
but how do you ensure that they have a role to come into and that they have the systems in place to be able to operate efficiently?
Yeah, so we're big fans of Loom. I'll go through like Loom videos, like record what we do as a process, and then you can give that to people. And then honestly, the VAs can make the Word document from the Loom video. We've done that a couple of times. And there's really two routes you can go. You can do like the Upwork or Fiverr route and hire them directly. But lately, we've been using actually a placing agency, and they're more expensive. So like, we pay them $10 an hour versus the 4 or 5, but they source the candidates. And so I then will have an interview with 3 or 4 candidates for who they think will be a good fit from previous roles or whatever that may be. And then they also create the SOPs for me, right? And so that has been my answer lately. I basically traded money for time. Instead of sourcing myself, I'm willing to pay more money per hour to this third-party agency that will help create some of those things. And they can kind of hit the ground running, right? So it takes a lot less of my time to create those documents.
That's great insight. We are in the process of hiring right now. We're hiring somebody who's going to be in person, but we are using Loom to create it's basically a virtual or a video SOP database for this person who we're bringing on board. And it's been very helpful so far. I think it's great to be able to walk through the motions, especially when there's nuance. And, you could write out 4 or 5 paragraphs for every nuance. and
Yep.
or you could just record it in Loom and say, here's everything that needs to happen.
Well, real quick too, and it might be different in the lending industry, but there is a reason there's not a lot of billion-dollar real estate like companies, because it is nuanced a lot. It is not like a scalable thing like software or a widget that you sell over and over again. Like every jurisdiction is different, every seller's circumstance is different, every house is different. So like you can get it to a place where there's like generalities are the same, but it is, I mean, not to like sound like it can't be done, because obviously it can be done, but it's scaling a real estate business is a lot different than scaling I would consider like a normal business.
Completely agree with that. And before we move on to my next question here, one third-party agency that I know does exactly what you were describing, where they help you hire offshore talent, is Support Shepherd. Is there one that you're using in particular that you've had a good experience with?
Yeah, I use Rocket Station right now. And so
Okay.
if anyone wants, I don't have an affiliate, but I can connect you with the people.
Okay. Awesome. Just feel like we should plug that stuff when we know that somebody does a good job.
Yeah, absolutely.
A buzzword in the real estate world, Dylan, is cash flow. You mentioned it earlier. You hear it every single day in our business. And if you spend any amount of time online, you'll definitely hear people talk about how much cash flow, and I say that in quotes if you're not watching the video, they're making from their rental portfolios. From your perspective, what's a common misconception about cash flow in real estate?
Well, one, I don't feel like a lot of the guru people out there underwrite correctly. And what I mean by that is they'll take their mortgage minus rents and say that's cash flow. When at the minimum, take your principal and interest, taxes, insurance. If it's not a single family home, you're probably paying for some utilities. So common area, electric, water is common here. And then putting, if you're going to have management, that's 8 to 10%. And then having those, ghost expenses, vacancy, CapEx, maintenance, repairs, that's another 10 to 15% off your gross rents. So if you can get all that to pencil out at $200 a door, whatever it may be, at 7.5% rates, good on you. Like that's really hard to find right now. So that's the first aspect, is that I feel like people need to underwrite more conservatively, or they're just going to get themselves in a bad situation. But secondly, like things will go wrong in your rentals, whether it be a roof, a plumbing fix, something, and that eats away at cash. One water heater can take away a whole year's cash flow, one furnace, whatever it may be. So I consider cash flow nowadays as like almost like a defensive mechanism, whereas like it will help pay for some of the upkeep for the properties. And I just think having 1 to 2 rentals to me doesn't make sense. If you're going to do the rentals, you should own at least 10, because like that at least gets some kind of positive reinforcement. And wealth is made in real estate from debt pay down and appreciation, in my opinion, not the cash flow that's $200 a door. Right. And so someone else is paying down your debt. You have some tax advantages, but if you buy in the right areas, just look from 2010 to now. I mean, it's been crazy, especially like pre-COVID and COVID stuff. I guess, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I agree wholeheartedly with that. And I think it's kind of a shame that there are so many people online who are projecting inaccurate points of
Yeah.
view about cash flow, because it
One
does.
thing I'll touch on that too, Chris, I forgot to say.
Yeah.
People are like the BRRRR method, right? The buy, rehab, whatever. I fucked it up, but whatever. The biggest aspect of that is not like, yes, you have your velocity of cash flow, which is great. But in my opinion, the second to that is you shouldn't have problems plumbing, electrical, roof, windows for 10 to 15 years. And that's the biggest part, because now that ghost expenses, we can maybe take that down a little bit, right? Because literally everything in this house is brand new. And
If you've
that's
done a good
been,
job on the rehab part.
yeah, doing a good job on the rehab, like almost taking it down to the studs, I would prefer to do, other than just like a few cosmetic flips here and there, because that will bite you in the ass.
Yeah. And I think a big part of this too, and not to speak for you, Dylan, but I'm curious about what your thought process here is. I mean, as you scale, when you first started, you were putting 25% down on duplexes that were listed on the market. Obviously, that's not very scalable, although it's a great strategy if you love your W-2 and you have a high performing job and you just want to do this as a long-term play.
Yep.
Totally understand that. I know people who do it and they do a great job. But if you want to do the real estate investing thing full time, or if you want to become a business owner in real estate, the cash really is extremely important, and building up that cash flow with rentals is really, really hard. So you mentioned this a little bit earlier as to one of the reasons why you started sourcing deals directly off market, right? You say you have some money tied up in flips. Can you kind of talk about the importance of the direct to seller deals that you're sourcing and wholesaling to other people in the grand scheme of your business as a whole? I mean, I know it's turned into a full-time job, but right, your long-term goal is to have enough rentals that it sustains your lifestyle and that you get enough wealth from the appreciation and paying down the debt. So talk about that cycle, about how much cash you bring in and how you manage having projects going on at any given time versus being able to scale your business.
Yeah, and it's a constant yin and yang, really, Chris. And like, so it's almost like one month is different than the rest. You look at how much capital you have, how much like in the bank, how much you have deployed in projects, and it's almost like, okay, what are we going to do this month based on the circumstance we're in now? And opportunities come up at different times, right? Like if I closed on a place yesterday, I put 30 grand as a down payment, as whatever, the loan proceeds. That's how that worked. But then another opportunity presents so that's too good to pass up. Now you're asking yourself, okay, how do I make this work? And where is this money going to come from? Right. And so really a lot of it is driven by how much money is currently in account and how much is currently deployed. But also if a deal comes in and let's say I can wholesale it and make 15 grand or 10 grand, right? Or I can take it down and make 40 projected, I'll probably end up flipping that. But I almost want that to be like a 2x difference, right? Now, if I could flip it and make 25 to 30 versus 15 on wholesale, I'm probably going to wholesale it, right? So like my little barometer at the beginning is I almost want the profit from the flip to be 2x the wholesale fee.
You really got to the heart of what I was asking, and I did not do a good job asking it. So I appreciate you saving me there with that question.
Yeah.
That's really good to know. How do you take into consideration, before I move on to our last question, how do you take into consideration the timing? So what if that 40 grand flip is going to take you 6 months, whereas you could wholesale it for 15? What's kind of the balance there? I know it's an art rather than a science, but
definitely an art versus a science. And unfortunately, I'm going to give you a somewhat similar answer. If we're flush with cash, I'd be more likely to do the flip. But when we're not, we'll more likely wholesale it. I'm doing a project now that I've owned for 11 months, and I don't want to ever do that again. So it's a higher end flip, and so it's just like lesson learned because rates skyrocketed during those 11 months, right? So that kind of hurt us too. But the thing with wholesaling is, yes, you have higher velocity of money. You're in, you don't have to do any of the work. But flipping, Cincinnati specifically, our inventory is still rather low, right? And so if you can stay in that median price point, I still think you have greater upside, right? So let's say you underwrote it at an ARV of 250, you might get an offer at 260, 270, right? So you still have a higher chance of getting that higher offer in today's real estate environment. So that I've been leaning into that a little bit more too, which is also a reason like we've been more likely to take down flips.
Yeah, it's an answer that always is going to start with it depends. And I know that, but I just like to ask it anyways to hear your perspective. As a side note, I read an article in the Business Courier this morning that said Cincinnati is one of the few cities in the country where our buying power is still higher than our average buying power per capita is still higher than our median housing price. And so our median housing price is like, let's say it's 240 or 250. It is somewhere around there, but I don't know the exact figure. And our buying power is somewhere in like the $330,000 range. These are averages, but I think just as a real estate investor, that's important stuff to know to inform your decision on what kind of strategy you're going to use. All right. Before we wrap up here, Dylan, tell us about the biggest mistake that you've made in real estate and what lesson you learned from it.
I'll give you two. I just touch on that high end flip, and it was a nice area, great school district. It's like 3,000 square feet. We took it down to the studs. I thought I brought it at a great price. We ended up going very, very much over on the rehab. And the caveat here is it backs up to a major highway, which I knew was a problem going in, but I didn't think it was going to be this big a problem when you get to this higher price point. The feedback has been great remodel, love the house, can't stand the noise. And when you're throwing around 700 grand, like I can understand that. So this will actually be the first deal we'd probably lose money on. Will be this deal. So, but you take your licks and you move on. The second one I would say is, like I said earlier, hindsight is 2020. And at the beginning, like I probably had some opportunities to buy some deals that I was either too scared or they didn't quite meet the return metrics I was looking for. And I should have bought more deals earlier in my career. So it was almost like that analysis paralysis, not being bold enough to take on to jump in, thought I was going too quick. In reality, I probably lost out on several $100,000 of equity by not pursuing those deals earlier.
I don't think that there's a single successful real estate investor that I've ever talked to who has not said I should have bought and held more earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So lesson out there for people listening.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dylan. I really appreciate it. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, if you want them to get in touch with you, how can they reach you?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to anybody. I'm not going to give out my cell phone, but just look at on like Instagram or Facebook. I'm active there. Just send me a DM on there and tell me you heard from this podcast and we'll have a conversation.
Perfect. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for sharing all your insights. Thanks for sharing your story. And hopefully we'll have you on another time too, because there's plenty that we could talk about here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the conversation, Chris. It's been great.
Awesome. That's all we have, everybody. If you found this conversation helpful, please share it with a friend, leave a review, and you can check us out at sharpercapital.com. I'll put all of Dylan's contact info in the description down below, and we'll see you in the next one.